I'm embarrassed to be an American in a place I don't recognize. Take that, Lee Greenwood. Welcome, teachers, students, and the generally curious to our 13th episode of the winter spring edition of the Constitution. What Constitution? In today's episode, we will be addressing the theme of freedom of thought and expression as revealed by the ideas of Voltaire and Anne Hutchinson, along with explaining how the founding of Rhode Island and the Stamp Act protest helped solidify these first principles. As I said in our last segment, I will be approaching all of our remaining topics with a sense of irony, meaning that I find it both troubling and amusing that we are talking about a constitution that may very well be on its last legs. Think about it. The felon-in-chief who attempted to upend democracy in 2021 bullies an ally who is fighting for democracy against the greatest tyrant of the 21st century. The carnival barker and greatest and draft dodger that bought his way into the White House for a second time lectures a modern-day hero whose name has become synonymous with bravery as he leads his nation in its defense against a rogue Russia. Talk about irony, actually talk about shock and awe. In a little more than a month, our lover of William McKinley has destroyed nearly 80 years of values and policies intended to maintain world peace and has taken us back to the grand old 19th century in which war, injustice, and corruption dominated. God bless the USA. Now, I feel a little bit better, if not a little fearful, that the Musk brown shirts may show up at my front door. So let's move on. It's time to check in with the band to find out their thoughts on this day in history, 1820, when Congress passed the Missouri Compromise. Is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know event in history? Professor Kavanaugh, what do you think?
I'm going to go needs to know. I think it's important to understand that as we teach history right to left or east to west, as we're moving, fulfilling our manifest destiny, so to speak, air quotes around that, we just continue to kick the can of slavery down the road. And we can't figure out what to do with this. And so we're going to continue to compromise and allow, we're going to allow this concept of popular sovereignty to take hold a little bit, but we're also going to, allow slavery to expand. And then, of course, that's going to be struck down in the Dred Scott decision because Chief Justice Taney says that Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate in the territories. But I think it's a very important signpost in American history. So I'll leave it at that.
Professor Moore.
Absolutely need to know, but for all the reasons Chris said. But bear in mind, the divisions and factious nature of that debate paved the way for the invite of Marquis de Lafayette to come as a symbol of unity and goodwill and transcending above political parties. So it's absolutely need to know.
And that goodwill lasted all of what, a minute and a half?
But it's beside the point. But
okay.
It paved the way for the invite for the Lafayette tour.
And we keep filling the cup for Unit 6 of Lafayette knowledge here and his contribution to American history. There, Professor Williams.
Yeah, it's definitely a need to know for the reasons of what Chris and Tim just said. And
well, maybe not.
No, I think every episode we're going to drop some Lafayette knowledge. I think it's interesting for that to think about. Like, we're living in this era right now where we would probably want nothing more than a good compromise on some of the big problems facing the United States. And in the beginning here, it's just a reminder of the one thing that we were really good at compromising on throughout our early history up to the Civil War was on the issue of slavery. As Tim mentioned, the debates in the Senate on this were really, really tense. And if you want to look at evidence that there weren't, that it was just there was nothing we could do. There were no other ideas out there about eradicating slavery. Take a look at those debates because some senators had some ideas. They knew it was time and they just couldn't get it done.
I cannot add anything to what the three of you have said. So good job there, my friends of Publius. So let's turn to our friend, our fop, who, as history tells us, may have been responsible for the carriage accident during the Second Continental Congress that led to Gouverneur Morris losing one of his legs below the knee. Professor Tim Moore. Tim, we want to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and Voltaire. So, in the context of the Enlightenment, would you consider Voltaire a radical? And do you consider his ideas about tolerance inclusive of religious tolerance? So, two-part question there.
I would consider him a radical. For well, let me back up. There's this theory that there are three, maybe four different flavors of the Enlightenment. There's the French, which some scholars say that's the radical Enlightenment. There's the David Hume Scottish version of the Enlightenment. That's the skepticism. And then there's the Lockean Enlightenment, the English. There's another school of thinking that there's an American Enlightenment too, and that kind of centers around the character and thinking of Franklin. But I think a lot of scholars, they put it on a spectrum. There's the radical, the skeptical, and they call the third version the liberal Enlightenment associated with Locke, and they all kind of have a different. They're all nuanced in two areas. They're all very political. The political implications of the Enlightenment is very much an emphasis on reason and rationalism. But when it comes to the use of history and the role of religion, you start to see some distinctions that demarcate between these three different versions. Like, for example, the radical, the Voltaire version of the Enlightenment advocates that history is largely meaningless, which is ironic because he writes so much of his. I mean, you talk about a person that cranks out letters. I mean, his letters, I think, are something like 100 volumes, just his over 20,000 letters. He also was a great coffee drinker, which some people speculate the reason he cranked out so much is because he had over 50 cups of coffee a day. But beside that, that'd make you radical just by getting all caffeinated. But this radical version of the Enlightenment looks at history as largely bunk and is very, very hostile to organized religion. Now, Voltaire, as a deist, did believe in a deity, but he was so very. There's a lot of been deconstruction of Voltaire that the nature of the Catholic Church in France made him into this radical position of despising all things hierarchical and Catholic. And so, Hume, that version of the Enlightenment says, well, history matters, but we got to be skeptical about received wisdom from the past. Let's be a little skeptical. And the same way with religion. You get to Locke, where history is important, and this Enlightenment rationalism is compatible and fits well within religion. So their positions on history and religion tend to parse them out. So Voltaire, I think, is clearly on the radical version of this Enlightenment. He had, yeah, I think that'll suffice so far. Yes.
Well, you understand why I asked
the
that,
second
right?
part, yes, I think it does extend to religious tolerance, so long as it's not organized religion. He had no patience for the organizational structures.
That was my follow-up. You've got to somehow square that circle. How can you have, how can you be pursuing tolerance of a variety of ideas, including religious ideas,
Yeah.
but not include organized religion, which
Yeah.
pretty much makes up 70 to 80% of society at the time, if
Oh,
not more.
absolutely. Maybe even more so in the West.
Right.
But I think he often used the word superstition as synonymous with organized religion, and thus had no patience for it. So
Didn't I think Voltaire said if God didn't exist, he would have to be invented anyway. But he
Okay.
said he's actually there in all of nature. So I think that deism that Voltaire is talking about reflects this push towards the natural world that we see in parts of the Enlightenment. I would absolutely agree with Tim's assessment about the French being the French Enlightenment being much more radical. I think he also said, what did Voltaire say? He said, I do like this one, Tim. History is a bag of tricks that we play on the dead.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, he's a great soundbite guy. I mean, it's really, yeah, you look up Voltaire quotes and it's hilarious. He's also a pain in the ass. I mean, just as a personality, he gets kicked out of everywhere, exiled, thrown out,
Yeah,
lives
in jail.
lives the rock and roll lifestyle. My gosh, I
Yeah,
mean,
because in a way he kind of was that way because he goes
yeah,
everywhere, then he writes things, and people get ticked off. He gets in jail or he
yeah.
has to flee, and he's kind of that guy that just is rabble rouser in a way.
Live fast and break things.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I asked is that, and I'm glad you say, yeah, he advocates tolerance, but not necessarily for organized religion, is by the time we get to the Second Great Awakening, Voltaire by members of that movement is seen as the Antichrist.
Well, there's a reason he's not quoted in the ratification debates. I mean, there's only two times that Voltaire is quoted, and it has nothing to do with political or constitutional theory. It was kind of in these convention debates where he's kind of a throwaway. To Chris's point, he's kind of a quote machine. So yeah, Voltaire is verboten because the American version of the Enlightenment does not have any patience for the radical version that he represents.
Okay, so Chris, again, through my reading this week, I find that most Americans, and I think we talked about this, some months ago about where America, is on the scale of freedom of expression here. And I came across, a consistent view that most Americans see freedom of expression as an absolute concept, that we can pretty much say what we want, when we want, where we want, kind of thing. So, based upon your understanding, is that true of Americans in the 18th century? Did they have an absolutist, which I tend to see Voltaire in many ways of an absolutist, who feeds into John Stuart Mill, then that keeps evolving there. So, is that how you would say the 18th century Americans
Uh,
see
no,
expression?
no. The expression in the 18th century was not nearly as absolute as it is in modern American society, right? You have foundational principles of free speech for sure. I would also throw in guys. I listed one essay in resources, Trenchard and Gordon, Cato's Letters, number
Yeah.
15. It's a great piece on free speech, and that was in the 1720s. So this is towards the end. Also, I listed another book about Spinoza. As a great overlooked Enlightenment thinker. You talk about a guy that was born into a Jewish family, but also his religion. It's an excellent book called The Courtier and the Heretic about Spinoza and Leibniz. Um, but you have some
Wait,
guys.
isn't Spinoza overlooked because nobody can understand him? At least on this panel.
I,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I read that book, Chris, and it was a struggle. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
was good. Here's another one to you. This is actually more of a struggle. It's called Voltaire's Bastards. So I listed these in the resources.
Is that a family history, a biography?
Well, he's chapter one. He's chapter one.
No, the subtitle of this is The Dictatorship of Reason in the West, and how they've taken Voltaire's logic and some of his philosophy and use it more as a controlling fashion. But back to your original question, David. No, there were not absolutists. My goodness, there were religious and moral constraints in the 18th century in many of the colonies, especially in New England. They were limited in what they could say, public expression, especially ideas about blasphemy. Holy smokes! Look at the Massachusetts Body of Liberty, 1641. Man, you can't be saying some stuff because you're going to be in a world of hurt. So, I mean, there's the beginnings of it, and there's also limited political expression. I think that absolutist view, and even today, I would even push back that, man, we limit speech. right? I
I'm
mean,
talking
look at
about the average American on the street. I'm not talking about eggheads like, you guys. I'm talking about the average. I mean, you listen, and again, you have to see this in your classroom. That's my freedom of speech. And then you
well,
try to talk about social contract analysis of expression, and people's eyes. No, no, no. I get to say what I want to say.
I tell them that everybody gets freedom of speech one time, right? After that, there could be issues. Um, but I mean, and these, I'm not sure that these people are eggheads. I'm going to say that with tongue firmly in cheek. But I just saw a post from our current president about limiting expression on college campuses for illegal protests and threatening people with deportation and arrest because they don't like the ideas that are being expressed. So I would say that is not an absolutist view in terms of freedom of speech, especially if you think about the protests that took place about the war in Gaza. We see a lot of limitations placed on what we would consider freedom of speech.
But there's a flip side to that, that
Yeah,
their political argument on a lot of these is that free speech. I mean, JD Vance goes to Europe and he says the challenge to Europe is not an external challenge from Russia, it's an internal
right.
challenge, and the so-called wokeness of Europe and Western society against the right of free speech of neo-Nazis in Germany, kind of
Yeah,
stuff. So, I mean, let's understand there's a two-sided coin of what Trump and his followers are saying is they take an absolutist view in one sense, and you're right, they take a fairly maybe more restrictive view that even the 18th century did on
yeah.
another
It's
set
very.
of
I
things.
mean, but you have people that are very selective, and we see that. And I think the average person is, freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. So I don't know that I would say that. I'd say the idea of having an absolutist view is probably more of an egghead view than the man on the street view.
Okay, so let me ask you, do you think Voltaire has an absolutist view?
Well, yeah, but as we just talked about, that dude's staying one step ahead of Johnny Law some places, or he's staying one step ahead of the people that are like, okay, enough, you're done, right? You're done here writing this stuff.
Okay, so pinpoint on a spectrum there, because the question implies that Voltaire is very influential on American ideas about expression. Yeah, you're saying that people were skeptical about Voltaire. So how do we
Well,
square that circle?
people in Europe and France were skeptical, especially just the communities, right, where he was writing. So of course he's going to be an advocate for free speech because he's getting tired of getting run out of town or getting arrested, which that whole idea. Um, so I don't know that Voltaire is that influential with our founders and our.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity for students to take exception to the premise of that question. Because the
Okay.
way I read the American founding, no one is using
Yeah,
Voltaire.
there's a fantastic book called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by some guy
Yeah.
named Bernard Balin. I don't know. He's kind of well known. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize. But if you read through the just yeah, I know, ho hum. If you read through even just like the first 35 pages, and he discusses the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment thinking and Enlightenment thinkers are on everybody's mind. People that are in favor of the revolution and people that are opposed to the revolution.
Yeah.
So they're well read, and both conservatives, what we would think of conservatives, loyalists, are citing them, as well as revolutionaries are citing them. So they're in the air, right? They're in the thought process, but no one's going, that Voltaire, he's my man, free speech, baby. It's just, yeah, I would push back on the premise of the question.
Okay, so to you, why has this guy become, in essence, a big name?
He's a
Why in
great
the 20th
soundbite.
century? Go ahead,
I mean,
Tim.
this guy is so great and a lot of the stuff is apocryphal. It's questionable whether said, "I defend your right to say it." That's the
He
great
didn't say
Voltaire
that.
quote.
That's
Yeah,
not him. That's actually a historian writing about him.
right.
I
But even he's dying, and he says, somebody's urging him to recant and convert. And he goes, renounce Satan, and he says, "I don't know. It's a little too late to make new enemies." I mean, this guy, he has He is he's wonderful for these throwaway, not throwaway, but great soundbite nuggets, and he's very witty. So I think there's a resonance. There's a intellectual playfulness in every one of these quotes that I think do resonate with a lot of people.
He reminds me a little bit of Twain. Mark Twain, who I really enjoy, who is acerbic and an acid tongue, right? And who will rip people, and people don't even know that he's ripping them. I think that he reminds me of Voltaire a little bit in Voltaire's writings. I think about Candide, it's probably his most famous work. It really is ripping on Leibniz. Leibniz is Candide, and he's really ripping on him as for his naivete and not understanding the world. And I just, it's pretty brutal.
And his optimism.
His optimism.
Okay, I'm glad that he amuses the two of you, but you still haven't explained why does this guy become, in essence, a major league player in thought, especially American political thought? If indeed he wasn't that much in France, nor was he in America in the 18th century, early 19th century, when does he become a big fish in a big pond?
I don't think he is.
I don't think he is that influential in early American history because for Americans, he's too much of a libertine. For most Americans, they're not going to get to the substantive theory of Voltaire because he's an absolute libertine in the way he lives.
So is it post John Stuart Mill that Voltaire starts taking on more heft?
I'm not going to presume to know that. I don't know.
Hopefully you understand, and to students and teachers, the question puts him in the forefront. And I'm trying to figure out why he's in the forefront because, to be quite honest, I couldn't find a heck of a lot as far as colonial, early or late colonial constitutional period where Voltaire, he's not Montesquieu, he's not Locke. Heck, I don't even think he's Rousseau. Kind of stuff. So I'm trying. That's why I'm.
Well, Rousseau is non gratis too for most Americans. They're not reading Rousseau at all.
Okay, Mike, you have any thoughts?
I think this to me relates to something we've talked about on this program a lot, like something like Federalist Number 10, right? How it has more importance today or in the last 50 years than it did at the time, and it does beg the question. Okay, sometimes I think we're reaching for Federalist 10 because we want it to prove something about what we want to think about ourselves now. And maybe Voltaire, I couldn't find anything in the record either about the founding. What I did find is that, like in the 19th century, as America is becoming more small d democratic, then to look back and kind of claim that Voltaire had something to do with the founding is just feels like it's a way for us to justify who we are becoming, and looking back in the past and finding those resources, even though the students are learning that the founders didn't think he was important at all, or not as important as others, right? So I think there's some of that going on.
I think too, and Tim said it, that quote that everybody attributes to him, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. I mean, so when we get these quotes that get attributed to people, all of a sudden he is the champion of free speech, which he was. He was advocating for free speech. I would say free writing, right? Because most of his stuff was written. It's not like he was public speaking, so it was writing. But I mean, so when we have a quote that gets misattributed to this guy, he takes it, like Mike said, he takes on a life of his own much later.
So, Mike, this question is, to be quite honest, this question is huge because although we have this theme of expression and tolerance and things, we got multiple kind of categories here. So one was Voltaire and the Enlightenment. Then we've got Anne Hutchinson. All right, and I believe that's 17th century. Is it 17th century Anne Hutchinson, or is that early 18th? Yeah, no, 17th century. Yeah. So the general historical record credits the trial of Anne Hutchinson as a contributing factor to expanding religious freedom and tolerance. Do you agree with that view? That she's up there in the pantheon of major things we should know in a need to know, or is it a nice to know, nuts to know?
Yeah, I think this is a nice to know unless you're from Rhode Island, and then maybe it's a need to know. I don't know.
What about Massachusetts?
Massachusetts as well, I guess. Um, I hadn't thought about Anne Hutchinson in a long time when I got this question, so I did my due diligence. But Tim and Chris and Dave, you can correct me on my history here. Yeah, it was like the 1630s. She's in Massachusetts Bay Colony. She takes on some of the Puritan ministers, and she gets convicted, and she gets kind of like kicked out. She gets banned, and I'm not sure the sequence here whether Roger Williams was already kind of thinking up the Rhode Island colony or not, but she kind of joins forces, and that becomes a place where there's going to be more religious liberty for folks that she could not find in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, so she's important for that episode. I didn't find much like it's not like American political culture or legal systems changed in the aftermath of Anne Hutchinson's sort of banishment from Massachusetts Bay Colony. It took a long time for things to evolve to get to a place where we would look back and say, yeah, what happened to her was wrong on a lot of different levels, right? Not just the religious level, but in terms of how she was treated as a woman and how she was treated by religious authorities. So I think it's important at the time. I think we can look back and say, oh, point to it as, oh, that's a marker. And it shows how there were folks at that period who were standing up for religious liberty, but it wasn't like the rest of the colonies followed in the wake. There was still a lot of religious oppression and suppression going on after Anne Hutchinson's trial as well. Yeah.
Well, okay, so how's that? And it sounds like you're saying the same thing about her as we said about Voltaire.
Yeah.
Is that somewhere in the 19th century, maybe 20th, we look back and we look at that the evolving principle of religious expression and tolerance and things, and we kind of go, oh, and we look back and now we lift her up
Right.
as some kind of pinnacle or some kind of grand example of this. I'm wondering, do you see America today as a religiously tolerant society? Well, and
Yeah.
it's part of, I think that's where, I
Oh,
mean, again, if I'm judging this question, that's part of what I want to get into because I'm more of a presentist than
yeah. Yeah.
I know Tim and Chris are. But
Yeah.
okay, what do you think? If
I,
indeed this is a fundamental principle,
yeah.
does that principle still live strongly in the hearts and
Yeah.
mind of America?
Yeah. 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 I think it's a great question. I'm smiling because it's a really good question. And by raising it, I'm going to encourage the students to think about what does religious tolerance mean? Like that's the way you have to you have to like think about, okay, so what does that term mean to me? And it's kind of it depends. I mean, compared to Europe, students should recognize compared to Europe, we are a much more religious society. Europe is much more secular. Religion is not part of the politics and part of the culture in Europe as it is in the United States. So I read some things this week that make two different arguments, right? They said because we are more religious and we have more religious diversity and more people practicing religion, that we are more tolerant because we're faced with it in ways that Europeans maybe aren't. At the same time, you look at any number of public opinion polls and ask people what they think about different religions, especially Muslims and Mormons are the two that kind of stand out. And these surveys are rough to do, right? Because people aren't likely to say what's really on their mind. So you have to ask kind of like side questions to get at it. But people don't seem as tolerant of those religions. Um, we can look at the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States. I think is a movement that is feeding off of a religious intolerance, right? That we are a one religion nation. We are a Christian nation. So I would say it's a great question for the students to think about. Um, I would say it, it kind of depends on which religion you belong to and which denomination you're in. You're going to think maybe we're a little more tolerant than others. And also depending on what's going on in the world. I mean, this students were not around for 9/11 like all of we were. And we remember the aftermath of that. I mean, it was out there. It was like you could touch it. in terms of the fear and the hatred and the stereotyping that Americans are doing with those who were Muslims. So I think we should take all that into consideration when thinking about it.
Tim or Chris, thoughts?
I'm thinking of two things here. One, I read this morning in a newsletter I get. It was a quote, so I had to look up. Okay, what's the quote? The quote was, "It's a great day for religious freedom in America." And I look up the quote, and it's from a lawmaker in the great state of Montana, right to my west. And he's happy because they've approved the idea of posting the Ten Commandments in the classroom, in public school classrooms. So it's a great day for religious freedom in America. Now they can post the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. Yeah,
Wait, no. I'm
there's
gonna
no
play
more.
devil's. Isn't that tolerance to allow that to happen?
I think there's no moron like an oxymoron.
Voltaire. I think he said that, didn't he?
I think he did. I think he did.
Yeah.
And the
Tim,
other
help
thing,
me out here.
I'm going to push back a little bit on Mike because
Oh.
when 9/11 happened, I teach in a suburban school, now a suburban school right outside of Indianapolis, and we had the Islamic Society of North America's international headquarters there. So I've had the privilege of teaching a lot of Islamic students, and that community had been in part of our community since the 1970s. And obviously 9/11. People from outside of our community are driving by, they're shooting at the sign, there are all kinds of threats. But people in our community, it was a pretty conservative community, a pretty religious community, pretty Christian community, rallied and defended their neighbors, saying we know these folks. They're Americans. They're as American as we are. They just happen to worship a little bit differently. So that actually made me feel pretty good about that community when that happened. So not everywhere, but there was a lot of hatred, obviously, directed towards people of the Islamic faith. But
Chris, in response to your Ten Commandments, I found this wonderful debate about tolerance just within Christianity, because one of the problems within Christianity is to define it. All right, what is a good Christian? Is it just John 3:16, or is there a little bit more to that? And the intolerance of Christian towards Christian, all right, is actually maybe in some ways stronger in certain areas than towards Muslim or whatever.
Well, our state legislature voted down the idea of feeding kids in schools, but they wanted to put the Ten Commandments in the cafeteria. So I'm thinking
food for the soul, baby. Food for the soul.
There's a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on all this religious tolerance stuff, and I think we've already articulated. I'd like to go back to your question about, is Anne Hutchinson that important in terms of creating a platform for religious diversity or religious tolerance? I tend to look at it much more broadly. Settlement patterns, for example. Now, again, we're not religiously diverse at the founding as we are now, but there is a great diversity within Christian denominations and sects. Like, for example, Maryland's a great example there. It's a haven for Catholics. But also, the Pennsylvania experiment too. I had to get Pennsylvania in there. Really wildly open to all kinds of denominations, and that largely because I think of Penn's personal biography and the persecution he may have faced as a Quaker in England. But so I think settlement patterns creates a milieu, a smorgasbord of various Christian denominations. Rhode Island also, I think the oldest synagogue, if I'm not mistaken, is still in Newport. So I think religious settlement patterns had a lot to do with creating this religious diversity and tolerance piece. And I also can't help but think Americans are prone to the great man theory in history, or in this case, in Hutchinson's case, the great woman theory. I think I couldn't help but think we look at Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, like he's a rock star now. Well, at the time, everybody hates him. He is not liked. He's not well received. But to Mike's point earlier, at some point, we kind of glom on to the great person theory of American cause and American progress and these kind of things. And I think, and Hutchison is so fascinating. The feminists the religion. There's so many things. You can do so many things with her biography that it's easy to, I think, pull her out and do that.
Mike?
Yeah, I forgot to mention something that the students are going to have maybe some lived experience with, and that is with the protests around the Israel-Gaza war. And I know what was happening on my campus, and the survey data on this is that, majorities of Jewish students before and after would say that they don't feel safe on campuses sometimes, right? So I think that that's something that the students should think about. And I was also thinking about, David, it's a documentary you got me onto. I think it was Ken Burns' Holocaust in America. That's another wake up call. Like, there was a lot of history in there I did not realize of the FDR's sort of policies and attitudes towards Jews at the time. So that's another maybe resource that I'll put in the resource thing this week.
Okay. So Chris, we go from Anne Hutchinson and it's a short little walk to Rhode Island. And the kids are asked to comment on Rhode Island. Now, when I was going through this, what first popped in my mind is, wow, is Rhode Island the first example of a sanctuary state? That its primary founding is to provide sanctuary to the unwanted, at least from Massachusetts. So I'm wondering what factors, and I think we've touched on a few of them, led to Rhode Island's unique role in colonial history.
Well, I think if you compare what happens in Rhode Island to what was happening in Massachusetts Bay Colony, I mean, the Providence Plantation becomes the Berkeley of its day. Honestly, and kids, you can look. Berkeley was known at one point for a hotbed of political activism.
Wait, can't we say Madison?
We could say Madison. We could absolutely say
Yeah.
Madison, Wisconsin, and
Yeah.
the Big Red Machine up there for sure. And probably Michigan too, Columbia. Anyway,
Yeah.
Rhode Island was definitely, when you compare Rhode Island to, or the Providence Plantation, founded by Roger Williams, in 1630s, so 35, 36, something like that. It is way out there to the left, and it does become a place for religious dissenters. And Tim was mentioning Jewish population, Quakers, Baptists, a lot of religious minorities tend to flock there, and part of that also is because of the economic independence Rhode Island had, with such a diverse. They're very small, but they have a pretty diverse economy. So that actually allows them to kind of do their own thing, maybe a little bit more independent of their colonial neighbors. But I don't think that, you could maybe put the idea of it being a sanctuary colony. I think that's a funny and insightful way of thinking of it. But obviously now we talk about sanctuary cities, we talk about sanctuary states. That takes on a whole different idea in modern context because,
Right.
Now we have a federal government that is trying to get tougher on immigration and going after folks. And
But it's not a real wacky idea of mine.
No, I think
it is a place for dissenters to go to and find some security and safety. And I'm wondering, Chris, to what extent is the culture of Rhode Island connected to the theology of Williams and Hutchinson? Is there any connective tissue there? Because aren't they both Baptists? Oh,
Yes.
man, are they both Baptists?
Yeah.
Well, Hutchinson is more what we would call today kind of a radical Pentecostal. I mean, she believed in visions and all of that. So, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons theologically that she's not going to be accepted in Massachusetts. But Williams definitely is. And it's been said that the difference, I like this distinction between Rhode Island and Massachusetts because in some ways it's been framed that these two places are still fighting Reformation issues. Like Luther comes along and challenges the Catholic Church, and then immediately there's this schism, and very quickly you have all kinds of Protestant denominations, all claiming various hierarchical systems and theological traditions. And I think your point about the Baptist piece in Rhode Island, as opposed to the Reformed and the Dutch, the English Reformed theology of Massachusetts. So there's, in some ways, they're still fighting the Reformation issues, and I think that's a classic example how that plays out here in the United States. And there's theology behind that. Yeah.
Well, and also the distinction between the Massachusetts Bay and Providence Plantation is the separation of church and state.
Yep.
The separation of church and state in Providence Plantation, which will become Rhode Island. That's a Roger Williams thing. We're going to separate that out. And obviously, if you look at the Puritan foundation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it is a theological society, right? It is a theology. Even though
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, Chris,
even though a couple of things that they may be in the middle 1600s, we might consider them somewhat back in the day progressive, not nearly as what we think of progressive that Williams is talking about in Rhode Island, and is separating out this church and state.
So is the disestablishment,
and that's a Reformation schism within Protestantism. What's the relationship between the kingdom of heaven and kingdom of man? All kinds of Protestant denominations answer that question differently, and I think Williams and the leadership in Massachusetts Bay answer that question, to Chris's point, very, very differently. That is a huge Reformation fight within Protestantism.
I want to come back to something, but to that, so what about Pennsylvania? If we can draw a correlation of theology to culture in Rhode Island, what is the explanation for Pennsylvania? Is it just William Penn?
Well, it's codified. I mean, it's codified in the sense that it's very open in terms of all kinds of diversity in non-establishment and equitable treatment to Native Americans. So I think the Quaker piece is highly individualized and decentralized in its theology. It's not hierarchical the way
Right.
the Reformed people would be, or the Catholic Church would be. So I think the nature of the highly individualized, highly personal nature of the Quaker faith, I think, comes to bear on that, and giving you individual space to do your religious thing. So I think there is a theology important in thinking about how it's codified in the Pennsylvania experiment.
So Chris, help me out. It just dawned on me, Williams predates Locke, and I've always associated Locke with the disestablishment movement, but it seems that we're possibly saying that the disestablishment movement actually begins in many ways in the American colonies before it really does in England.
Well, certainly in Rhode Island, not necessarily say in other places like Virginia, where the Anglican Church. I mean, so in Rhode Island, I think partly, and I'm going to dovetail on what Tim was describing with Pennsylvania. I think ultimately with Rhode Island, it's also because it is somewhat of a haven for dissenters, and you end up with these various groups, and its small size really helps the spirit of independence that they have, their diverse economy and diverse population. It makes them a little distinct from other colonies. I don't know that his ideas of this separation of church and state is really going to take hold in other colonial settings.
Right.
So I don't know that are more people in the middle 1700s reading Locke, or more people going, hey, what did that Roger Williams have to say a century ago? So I don't know. And because of it, I think Rhode Island's role in the 18th century colonial history is shaped by its commitment to religious tolerance, but there's also economic independence. They resistance to royal authority. They're kind of like, we're small. We got a lot of different types of people here. We're going to let these different types of people live their life, and y'all can just take a hike. I mean, think about it. Who doesn't attend the Constitutional Convention?
They're the first ones to say "your mama," to the world, kind of thing.
Yeah. Maybe Shakespeare. I bite my thumb at you.
Yeah. So, all right. Now we go to a different. I don't know if it's a different period, but a different category here, Professor Moore. And the students are also asked to deal with the Stamp Act protest. I'm assuming 1765 is when we're talking about. And I'm just curious, okay, so expression, tolerance, all these wonderful ideas. Was this protest an example of civil discourse?
Oh, sure.
Really?
The British, absolutely. Now, I think a broad view, I don't know whether it was last year or it was previous years, we had a Dickens of a time when we were thinking about what is political violence a part of, discourse. Now, I happen to think that it can be, and throughout our history has been. So yeah, I think I mean there's a British legacy of the use of violence politically. And the Americans inherit that. I mean, I jotted down these these are all colonial civil unrest: Bacon's Rebellion, Culpeper Revolt, the Boston Revolt, the Leicester Revolt, the Cary Revolt, the Boston Bread Riots, Philadelphia election riots, the Paxson Boys, the Regulators, the Liberty Riot, the Boston Massacre. I mean, the colonial world is full of unrest, and I'm seeing that as a form of political discourse. Now, the better question is it effective? Well, all of the protests of the Stamp Act were very effective. Parliament backs down and rescinds the Stamp Act because of the response. Burnings and effigy, tars and fire. I mean, there's violence due to that Stamp Act. And it's not just because of the money. I think it's more important. It's the constitutional principle that they're fighting over in the Stamp Act. Now, Parliament shoots themselves in the foot the same day they rescind the Stamp Act. They issue the Declaratory Act and basically says, okay, we rescinded the Stamp Act, but we have the right to do whatever the hell we want, bind you in all cases whatsoever, and everything you've done prior to this is null and void. Well, great. You think the Stamp Act's going to make people mad? I think it was Adams many years later said right there and then, or no, you might have been talking about Otis. But a lot of people looked at 66, the Declaratory Act, as the beginnings of the revolution. So I do see the Stamp Act response in the colonials. I mean, all these towns and these states got together. There was a lot of rattle and hum before anybody showed up to New York for the Stamp Act Congress. That's another piece of this. How much rattle and hum goes on before the official national document, so to speak, was issued by the Stamp Act Congress. So there's a lot that's going on, at the bottom up level in the Stamp Act crisis.
Well, and I would say that the issue of protest and violent resistance is part of the heritage of American colonists, back to the old country. That if we look at the peasants' revolts,
Yep.
after Luther, well, even before Luther, after Luther, we look at the French Wars of Religion, which really was not massive in my sense. It's more of a local issue. That there's a tradition
Guy
amongst,
Fawkes.
well, yes, very much so. I am wondering though, Tim, do the British have any concept of freedom of expression in the 18th century within their own political culture, not including the colonies? Because I am
Well,
wondering if their
yeah.
repression, their response, which you say is very violent, is that the same as it would be back in England?
Well, remember that there's a key phrase in all this. In that time period, they would talk about indoors and out of doors. And the theory is that Parliament is the mouthpiece of the nation. And if you get and if you then and this is the reason why some historians say that there's this tradition of political violence in English history is because people are not happy with Parliament being the sole voice of popular sentiment. So they take it out of door. There's this out of doors speechifying, rattle and hum protest that occurs. There's nothing officially there institutionally for the out of door folks. It's only this expression in Parliament. So I think that's important to think about. There's nothing formally organized for the mere mortals, the regular folks. There's no mechanism of official expression of their political sentiments. So it's reserved to Parliament. So I think that, and then you multiply that by across an ocean. I think that gets ratcheted up quite significantly. I mean, the British response to all of this stuff has always amazed me. I mean, the Parliament. When you get to the 70s, you get the Boston Massacre, and you get the Tea Party, you get the Prohibitory Act. You're not going to trade with anybody. The Proclamation of Rebellion, the Intolerable Acts. There's four disastrous laws. I mean, it's always amazing to me that Britain has this tradition of enduring political violence and kind of keeping a lid on it. But when it comes to America, they seem to just not get it.
So you know
And
who your your discussion right now reminds me of one of my favorite books from years ago, Barbara Tuchman and the March of Folly. You seem to be arguing that this was a situation not in which the Americans believed in something wholeheartedly and they won. It's mainly a situation in which England continuously screwed up. Is that your take?
no, both things are true. I think Americans deeply, and ultimately, they're in that embedded in that statement is what was the American Revolution over? What were they fighting over? I think there is a sincerity in the American protest and resentments and the political violence at times that occurs. And I also think that it's one straw on the camel's back after another on Parliament's part. So I think it's both.
So
I'm
assuming,
gonna.
go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. I just want to jump in because I do think that. I mean, I mentioned Trenchard and Gordon earlier. These guys are
Yeah.
writing these things called Cato's letters, and both of these guys are really strong Whigs, and they are. Yeah. Sorry,
There
I'm
we
working
are.
that in for
Wigs.
Tim. Everybody, a little leftover tea, and they are, channeling Algernon Sidney. So I mean, this was in the 1720s. Now they start writing in response to what they see as corruption in Parliament with
Yeah.
this South Seas Company and some other things. And so they begin their writing, but there is public writing going on and pushing back. And again, letter number 15 in volume number 1 for students talking about free speech. There's some great insights in there on free speech. So there are people within England pushing back.
Right.
I
And go
can't
ahead,
help
Tim.
but also think about, Jefferson years later. He was very glib about rebellions. There's a whole window of time in this 4 or 5 month period where every letter that he wrote, he used the winds and the tornadoes analogy that rebellion is kind of like these winds that are periodically, and a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty, all that kind of stuff. So I think Jefferson is kind of tapping into that tradition that, raising hell is kind of in our DNA, and that's what we inherited, and so be it. Now, Abigail Adams goes ballistic with that, writes him a blistering letter.
Yeah, you weren't here. You don't know.
Yeah, we're not here. You're not here. Yeah.
Yeah, you jumped on your horse and rode away when the British showed up. So let's not be talking about that.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I thought he was governor of Virginia and had to flee at one point. The
Yeah,
governor's mansion, right? He was there for a period of time.
Well, this was during the 80s when he's in Paris that she
Yeah. Okay.
takes him to
Yeah.
task over
Yeah.
yeah,
Shays. Yeah.
So, Professor Williams, this is all about civic education, and civic
it is.
education
What?
emphasizes.
What?
Yes, it is. It's not just a vanity exercise for the four of us. It actually there's I guess, an overwhelming, overriding purpose here of civic education, which strongly emphasizes civil discourse as a skill that needs to be taught and is necessary to a healthy constitutional democracy through my research this week about expression, and we've talked about this subject in a variety of different kind of contexts here, but through my studies, there are these. Someone started to say there's these key moments in history, and I'm wondering if you believe we're in one of those key moments when it comes to expression and discourse in a constitutional democracy, and if you believe, as I do, that social media, as representing this key moment, is actually a moment of darkness and a negative as far as the history of expression and tolerance and undermines civil discourse. Where are you at on that? Do you agree with me that this key moment, especially with social media, is really a turning point towards the darkness of the world, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the essence of your question is has social media harmed civil discourse, right? And
Yeah.
I would say I agree with you. I would say it's on the one hand, it's allowed for more speech, right? There are more opportunities, there are less gatekeepers, and in a certain world with certain norms, I would say that might be a plus. Um, but I think the way that the platforms have been allowed to sort of configure, and in the last 10 years with a changing of norms about what we are allowed to talk about, and then with social media, um, not only the ability to say it, but then the ability to then the algorithms giving you just back the echo of what you're saying to people. You used the right word, David, when you said that civil discourse is a skill. It's a practice. It's something that no one is, I don't think, born with. You have to do it. And if you're on your phone all day, getting the same messages repeated back to you, um, maybe sending stuff out with a cute handle where people don't know who you are and stuff. I don't think that's good for civil discourse. Now, I, I do think we're at a technological sort of like Rui Sakari has called it one of the revolutions, right? Um, Ezra Klein just this morning had something on AI, and it made me think that maybe we're at the end of one revolution and about to enter another. With I guess AI is much closer to doing a lot of things the next couple of years than a lot of us were thinking of, and we have no idea where that's going to take us in terms of civil discourse and being able to even recognize the authenticity of who's saying what, where it's coming from, type of thing. Um, I don't think we're permanently doomed. I think there's examples throughout the 19th and 20th century of technology coming along, and there are ways to regulate it. There are ways for norms to catch up with it. I'm not super confident about that right now. Um, I think if
Yeah, you
it,
just took my follow-up there because, and I guess I appreciate your hopefulness. I don't
yeah,
see how we go back. I don't see how we contain this wild animal of social media and the algorithms. I mean,
yeah, I don't think we go back. Here's my thesis, my hypothesis. I think you're beginning to see it that this is all consumer, this is people driven. And I think that this is like physics, right? There's an action and there's a reaction. And I think I see it with young people today in college who are doing things with their friends, trying to get offline, trying to think of ways that they know. It's really interesting. You talk to a college student, they know it doesn't make them feel good. I mean, they'll tell you, yeah, I'm doom scrolling all day. I'm on Instagram, on X. I don't feel good after. And my hope is that there's going to be enough of that sort of an awakening where people are just going to start using the social media differently. And then the media corporations are going to have to catch up. It's thin. It's a thin hope. I'm not
yeah,
trying to, but
I'll try to remember to put because I found a couple of different studies, and obviously educators have tried to come up with curriculum to educate young people
sure.
on how to manage this new technology, this social media. And the two studies I looked at said most of them are not successful.
No.
That is schools, unless it's consistent, starting in kindergarten all the way through to high school, that these isolated curriculums to try to teach kids how to function in a democratic society with this new technology, they're not real successful there, which diminishes any optimism I have that we can manage this. Chris or Tim, thoughts on that?
I wonder whether there's a maturity piece here because I know I'm intrigued by Mike's observation that some college, and I know on our campus too, there's college kids that are abandoning the smartphone. So I wonder whether there's a maturity thing where you gotta, you gotta go through the madness of the algorithm world and then eventually come to the conclusion that in my estimation, a mature decision to cut back or eliminate. So I wonder about the maturity piece on this.
We we talk about, we mentioned this before. We have rights, but with those rights come responsibilities. And so when you can become a keyboard warrior and say things to someone online that you would never say to their face, because you understand that, one, you might get your butt beat, or two, when you actually see a person's response, and that natural sense of empathy kicks in, which we've kind of lost, is that sense of empathy. Um, but also, there was a piece on 60 Minutes not long ago, where they're showing and I forget the European nations, Finland, I think maybe Finland or Sweden,
Yes.
and they were doing media literacy
Right.
starting at the kindergarten level.
And
They
that's,
were,
yes.
they were doing media literacy at the kindergarten level, so kids could sift through the bovine fecal matter and understand that, well, if there was really an alien spaceship, it might be reported other places. So they're teaching them how to sift through that online world of a lot of stuff, that perhaps the algorithm throws at you. And they do that from an early age. But we are reluctant to do anything like that.
Well, and again, and they do it consistently from early childhood
Yes.
education all the way through to early adult education, or high school, I guess we would call it. There, our problem is, and I know this for a fact in my local community, that teaching that kind of course, just to differentiate between what is a legitimate source, what's truth versus, those kind of things, that's seen as indoctrination by the liberal intelligentsia. The elites are trying to take away Fox News. I mean, again, myself and a colleague in my last 2 years of teaching, we tried to come up with a course, and all we were trying to do is help kids try to swim through the morass of information and differentiate between a legitimate, source, not about, what the position it
Sure.
takes, but what is that? And we had parents go nuts. You're trying to control what my kids read, see, hear, that kind of stuff. And I don't think they go through that in Finland, Sweden, and
No,
other places.
Well,
I
I
remember
think there's a communitarian cultural piece to that.
very much
Uh,
so.
I think I'm going to inject my. I guess it befalls me to constantly beat the drum for communitarianism, but I think I guess I'm not so worried about news silos. I'm more concerned, like, okay, once you get done feeding your brain full of all your information from your news silo, are you going to go down to a coffee shop and talk with somebody where their news silo may, run up against your news silo, and you may have to have a conversation. So I guess that's the communitarian piece. If I kind of share Mike's cautious optimism that I think the radical individualism that's pervasive in our culture will collapse. And I hope what fills that void is some sort of, and I think young 20 somethings are realizing the communitarian piece is missing if I'm doom scrolling, if I'm in my silo all day. I think the communitarian impulse is intuitively there. I just hope that it will come to the fore when we're all tired of this radical expressive individualism that we seem to be drowning in. I would say.
Chris?
Um, I was thinking of, they do continue that on, but I was thinking, Dave, years ago, we had a group of We the People kids, and we were doing some fundraising in the community to try and get to nationals. And we were talking about media literacy courses. And we're doing this presentation in where I used to live, fairly conservative community. But the kids are obviously, put the kids out there and let them do their thing. And we had a person there said, well, that's a great idea. We need to be able to teach that, kind of thing. And she asked the kids, where are they doing that? And the kids said, well, it's happening in California. And then her immediate response was, oh, well, no, because the idea is, this is California's a liberal bastion, and so that's the whole idea. And I actually called her out on it. I said, wait a minute, you just said it was a good idea, but you don't like it because of your notion of what you believe California to be. So is it either a good idea or not a good idea to teach kids to be media literate? And to Tim's point, I'm not that, and to Mike's point, I am not that hopeful as a person that sees kids that cannot walk down the hallway without having their phone in front of their faces because of the addiction, the addictive nature of social media. And again, I think I mentioned this on this program before, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and what smartphone technology does to the rewiring of the adolescent brain. And this is back to Mike and Tim's point about maturity. As you're moving through, your frontal cortex is formed, you're in college, and then maybe this is perhaps you've learned to wean yourself. But I don't know that right now, with the addictive nature of social media and smartphone technology, that it's going to change anytime soon. So I'm a little more leery. I'm not as hopeful.
Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our hour, and so it's now time to provide final thoughts and recommendations for students and teachers as they deal with not only, with this big idea of expression and tolerance, but through a myriad of different categories there. So, Mike, what are your thoughts and recommendations?
Yeah, I thought your questions are always great. I thought your questions today were really good for the students because I'm I'm kind of envisioning that despite what we pointed out about maybe the importance of Voltaire and Anne Hutchinson, um, they need to talk about it, but I think they should be ready for this more general discussion of the kind of the questions you were asking today. Um, so I would encourage them to be thinking about not just these historical moments and how it relates to the Unit 1 curriculum, but thinking about how freedom of expression, freedom of religion, church and state is kind of operating in their lives and in their communities, and have something ready to talk to judges and their teammates about with that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking through the last hour about uh, the false notion that it takes crusaders to further principles. And I think in terms of expression, there are these significant individuals, Voltaire maybe, Hutchison maybe, I don't know, but I would urge students to think about, like in your cafeteria, are you going to speak up for the other? That's as courageous as an important in my estimation as any of these others, these great figures in history. So I would really urge students to think about what you can do at a very personal, basic level to speak and to speak on behalf of others too. So that I wouldn't want that to get lost in all this philosophical discussion about these very abstract and distant, and the scale is tremendous. It can occur at a very basic, simple level.
Chris?
That's good. I like that because we talk about bystanders and being a bystander and being an upstander. The difference between being an upstander and being a bystander. I was thinking of our discussion that I have in class about Elie Wiesel's Night and the Holocaust and people that maybe didn't do anything to help it, but they didn't do anything to stop it, right? And which is everybody, and that's a difficult thing for people to step up. But I also agree with Mike. Your questions are outstanding for kids because these are huge ideas in terms of freedom of expression, toleration, perhaps diversity, which may not be may be out of fashion these days. What was going on in Rhode Island might be out of fashion today. Colonial Rhode Island, that is. So pay attention for the students watching this, pay attention to the questions that Dave has asked us, because I think you can take those in a lot of different directions. I think just have some ideas about where, and I know I talk about this all the time, you can't straight line today to back to then, but I think these are big enough ideas in terms of freedom of expression, toleration of views, toleration of ideas, freedom of religion. I think there's a big enough ideas that you can think about where you are today in that. And again, always think about your community, think about your state, and then think about the nation and think about the world. So think of it in that way.
This is to be quite honest, I mean it's a unit 1 and but it's big because you have this central theme, but the question gives you four categories. You've got Voltaire, you've got Hutchinson, you got Rhode Island, and you got the Stamp Act protest, which implies that you got to know a little bit about all of these things. And I guess my big question, and I don't know to what extent we really nailed it, is okay, what is the contribution? What's the distinction between Anne Hutchinson and the founding of state Rhode Island? What's the distinction between the founding of Rhode Island and the Stamp Act protest as far as expression and tolerance go? And so you have quite a task, students and teachers, to both have the big picture of expression tolerance as well as these four different historical, either philosophical or historical periods there to be able to talk about. So, hey, as we tend to say, good luck to you, Unit 1. I hope we've given you some things to think about. Please let your Unit 5 compadres know that in our next session, we go from the very broad, huge question that you guys had to a very narrowly tailored question on the Fourth Amendment and exclusionary rule, which we're looking forward to. So until then, peace, love, Yogurt Tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.